All right, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Wassalatu wassalam ala nabiyyina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa ashabihi ajma'in amma ba'd. Last week we began speaking about colonialism, and I'm going to go over it again and add more detail. It's a lot of information, especially since the way I'm presenting it is more at an intellectual academic level. But I feel like it is very important for us to know about this because this is the reality that we are dealing with. A lot of times we don't realize we are dealing with this. It's only after you put in a lot of time in researching this does a person see how much they are caught up and they're tangled in the web of modernity, what's called now modernity and post-modernity. But it is important for us to at least scratch the surface so that we have an idea of what we are dealing with, and to better understand why Muslims have been struggling over the past 100 years, ever since colonialism began, and to also understand why, aside from the fact that Islamic institutions and institutions that train scholars of Islam, aside from the fact that they have collapsed and become very almost for a certain time non-existent, right? That is one of the reasons why Islam or Muslims have weakened. But another reason is that the resources that we have when it comes to Islam, although it is massive, we have a massive library, right? But the way this information was presented in these books is in the pre-modern era, right? They are dealing with their realities. Now, this isn't to say that what they said is incorrect. Quite the contrary. We believe that what they said was correct, right? But the way they said it is irrelevant to our time today, or it's not used in our times today. So it's about us understanding Islam the way the traditional scholars who Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has raised their names, understanding Islam the way they taught us, but using today's language to present it. This is a very big challenge, right? And this is what we need to do. So colonialism, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in Surah An-Naml, quoting or speaking on behalf of Queen Sheba, as she's called in English, the Queen of Saba, which is in present-day central Yemen. There's an area called Saba, which now it's called Ma'rab. She was in that area, and her story is pretty well known. She was the queen of her people and the highest authority. There was no king. And she was known to be very wise, to the extent that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala actually shows us her wisdom. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala agrees with her in some of what she says. He affirms what she is saying is correct, as this verse says. So she was very just. She had a strong style of government. She had her cabinet, who she sought their insight and their input before ever making a decision. And she says, "Ma kuntu qati'atan amran hatta tashhadun." No, I don't make a decision until you testify and you put your input as well, right? So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is quoting her in a positive way, and we know that she ends up becoming a Muslim after seeing what she saw when she met Sulaiman alayhi salatu wassalam. And the context of this is the following. Sulaiman alayhi salatu wassalam is informed by the hopo, the hudhud, the small bird, that there is a kingdom, right? There is an area of land that you don't know about, that I have come across, right? قَالَ أَحَطُّ بِمَا لَمْ تُحِطْ بِهِ. I have attained information that you don't know about, right? وَجِئْتُكَ مِنْ سَبَإٍ بِنَبَإٍ عَظِيمٍ. I come to you from Saba with some important news, right? وَجَدْتُهَا إِنِّي وَجَدْتُ امْرَأَةً تَمْلِكُهُمْ وَأُوتِيَتْ مِنْ كُلِّ شَيْءٍ وَلَهَا عَرْشٌ عَظِيمٌ. He describes this area called Saba as their ruler is a woman. And that's very strange for that time. In fact, throughout human history, it's very strange to find a woman at such a high caliber. Now in Islam, we have a few examples as we have gone over in other settings. But this is something very strange. And he describes her kingdom as وَأُوتِيَتْ مِنْ كُلِّ شَيْءٍ. She has access to everything. She has an abundance of resources and a very large variety of resources, which shows a very proficient kingdom and a very economically flourishing kingdom as well. وَلَهَا عَرْشٌ عَظِيمٌ. And she has a great throne. And the throne is a symbol of the king and the kingdomship, right? So her having a great throne is resembling her great kingdom. So the Hopo tells Sulaiman والسلام, this, and Sulaiman sends her a letter. And he says, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, Allah ta'alu alayya wa atuni muslimin. Right? In the name of Allah, the benevolent, the most merciful, Allah ta'alu alayya, do not try and put yourselves above me and come to me as Muslims. Meaning submitting to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This is all what he said. Right? So, in light of this letter, she probably heard of Sulaiman. Now, Sulaiman had an army that's unrivaled in human history. So I'm sure she probably heard of Sulaiman والسلام, and there was probably murmur that Sulaiman is claiming to be a prophet of Allah. He's not working as a king, he is working as a prophet. And she wants to test the waters and see what happens. So she gathers her cabinet and she asks them, what should we do? Her cabinet seemed to lean towards war. قالوا نحن أولو قوة وأولو بأس شديد. We are people of strength and we are people of might. والأمر إليك. But we will do as you tell us. She responds with the following. قالت إن الملوك إذا دخلوا قرية أفسدوها وجعلوا أعزة أهلها أذلة. She says that when kings enter a city or a village, they cause mischief by killing, by stealing, right, by taking them as prisoners. And also what they do is they flip the social structure. They make the elites the lowest. But at the same time, they make the lowest the elites. Right? And this is very important. This is probably a constant throughout political warfare. Right? Why is that? When a foreign entity enters a country or a land, right, they cannot control that land by themselves. They need the help of the natives. They need the help of the natives. They know the land and whatnot. Who is willing to work with a foreign entity? Not the elites. The elites have what they want. And part of their honor and their dignity is coming from the state itself or the land itself, right? They're not willing to work with the foreign entity. Who's willing to work with them? The lower part of the social hierarchy. They probably have a lot of resentment towards the elites, right? They're looking for a way out. Their loyalty to the state is probably weak because they're not really benefiting much from the state, right? So they come in and this foreign entity comes in and they utilize this group of people and they make them the elites. They switch the social hierarchy, right? And now you have the elites, the new ruling party, who is very much in allegiance to and working for and under this foreign entity. And this is perhaps what happened during colonialism. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَكَذَلِكَ يَفْعَلُونَ. Right? He affirms what she said to be correct. Yes, they do that. Right? So when you look at colonialism, this seems to be what happened. When these foreign European countries entered the Muslim world, right, not only did they change the style of government into a nation state, which we'll talk about, not only did they introduce new ideologies that were, before this time, pretty much non-existent or unknown, they also flipped the social hierarchy. So when you look at the Muslim world today, right, for the past, since the 60s, since the Muslim world got out of colonialism, at least, what's the word I'm looking for? On the outside, right? Looking at it from the outside, maybe not from the inside. But when they got out of colonialism, right, by that time, the colonial powers had already flipped the social hierarchy. Before colonialism, the Muslim rulers were good, generally speaking, good rulers. If you look at Egypt, for example, during the earlier times of colonialism, or maybe even just before colonialism, any of these regions, these areas, right, you find that they were actually technologically doing well. They were cleaner cities, and you can find pictures of this, right? Not like what you see today, where it's just garbage everywhere, and the roads are broken apart, the buildings look like they're going to fall apart, right? It was different. But what colonialism did was take the corrupt part of society, who were willing to work with the colonial powers, and made them the leaders. Thus, you get people like the Assad family, who are now in power, and you get people like Jamal Abdel Nasser, and these other many corrupt leaders who are now in power. Prior to that, they didn't have a say. Why? Because society, the better of society were in the elite class, but that was flipped over. And perhaps, that's my theory to explain why Muslim rulers today are so poor and bad. It's not because Muslims are bad, right? It's because these powers shifted the social hierarchy. And the second thing that was introduced in light of, or because of colonialism, was the following. The nation state, secularism, capitalism, and Enlightenment rationality. Colonialism, right, which was a result of modernity, introduced the previous these four, to the Muslim world. Okay, so with colonialism came these four new ideologies. And I say ideologies so that we look at these things beyond just being for example, a system of, or a style of economics or a system of government, right? These are ideologies. Before they were implemented in Europe, right, in the West, they were ideologies, philosophies promoted by philosophers, right? And this is why it's important to understand this. We are not living a world that just kind of came about because of the government. We are living the world the 15th, 16th, 17th century Western philosophers developed for us, right? So liberalism, for example, is not just something humans chose, right? It was a philosophy that was promoted and adopted by the elites. This is how it works. So colonialism comes and they introduce these four things. And this creates a lot of problems for the Muslim world, especially Islamic scholarship. Again, not because Islam is incapable in addressing these issues, nor because Islam is incompatible with these realities. It's just because modernity created a rupture in really human history. It changed the way humans look at the world. It changed the way humans engage the world. It changed the style of government. It changed the human identity as well. Right? When you introduce nation state, as we'll get to in a moment, it changes a person's identity. We no longer define as someone of a religion. We define ourselves or identify ourselves based on our nationality. And thus comes nationalism, right? And we'll get to all of these in a moment. So the nation state. By definition, the nation state is a form of political organization under which a relatively homogeneous people inhabits a sovereign state, especially a state containing one as opposed to several nationalities. Nation states reintroduced nationalism, formerly known as tribalism, to the Muslim world. Right? So now today you see I am Palestinian and I am Syrian and I am Pakistani and I am Malaysian. Right? Prior to colonialism, these weren't said. You don't find a Muslim saying I am Palestinian. Right? They'll say I am from the city, I am from Bukhara, for example. Right? I am from Fez in Morocco, I am from Damascus. But for someone to say I am Syrian, that simply was just not there, right? So nationalism, which is a very big problem in Islam and in the Muslim world, right, comes because of this. Now I want to show you a video that explains nation states, inshallah, and it is benefit. Okay, hold on, let me. All right, so that video is very much fueled by socialism and the left ideology and atheistic perspectives, but he brings up some interesting points. Why is it that we here in California identify more with New Yorkers who live 3,000 plus miles away than with Mexicans who live 100 miles away from us? Right? It's an interesting concept. Now, from an Islamic perspective, we're not saying this is haram. Right? It's not haram, right? It's nothing morally wrong with having borders, okay? And we're not saying that, or I'm not saying that the whole idea of nation states is a conspiracy to control the world. Maybe part of it is, right? And other things is for organization. Without these countries, you can't have the UN, and without the UN, a lot of, although they are powerless in some areas, for example, against Russia and the U.S. and crimes that may be carried out by these two countries, but in other ways, the UN is kind of, an entity to hold certain people accountable that may not be accountable without that entity, right? So I just want to make sure that's clear, but it does have implications on us as Muslims when it comes to our identity. How do we view ourselves, right? The average Muslim in the Muslim world views themselves based on their ethnicity or the country of their origin more so than Islam. Now, I'm not saying that they doubt Islam or that they don't care about Islam, but that's just the mindset that we have been growing up in. Now, we here in America, because we have to sit next to each other, right? We live in an environment where we don't have the luxury of being part of the majority, right? We need to work together as minorities, and I'm talking ethnically speaking. So we here in America are trying to develop a community, or communities are trying to develop themselves to where they are inclusive to Muslims of all ethnicities, right? Rather than of an ethnicity, right? Now, of course, there are masajid that haven't done as good of a job as others, but that's just the reality on the common ground. Now, your kids are more likely to marry a Muslim of a different ethnicity or nationality than maybe your generation or the generation before you. I know sometimes parents, they don't like the idea of their child marrying, an Arab mother might not like the idea of her child marrying a Pakistani girl, for example. I'm sure you've heard of stories like this. But guess what? Growing up in America, I remember when I was in grade school, there was a black boy next to me, and then an Asian, and a white, and then a Latino, for example. To us, hey, it's perfectly fine, right? But your generation had it a little bit different. Again, the point I'm trying to make is to point to this, the notion of nation state and how it affects our view of the world in general, right? The next thing is secularism. Now, last week I spoke a little bit about secular versus secularism. Secularism being the ideology, right? Whereas secular being how do we implement certain elements of the ideology, right? And I said that Islam isn't secular in terms of the ideology. It is against secularism as an ideology, but not everything in Islam is fueled by the Quran and Sunnah. What do I mean by that? When it comes to fiqh, right? Fiqh, the Quran and Sunnah, is not interested in every single small element of our daily lives. The Quran and Sunnah did not say anything about the rules of the road. Quran and Sunnah has not said anything about, for example, the concept of a passport, right? Quran and Sunnah did not say anything about the style of your home, right? The architecture of your home or the interior design. It's not concerned with that. So if we were to develop a system that does not consider Quran and Sunnah in our development of these various aspects of life, technically that is secular, but it's not against Islam. Why? Because Islam is not concerned with it. If Islam was concerned with it, it would have said something about it, right? There are certain things that Islam is concerned about, and the Quran and Sunnah did address it. And in that regard, we must adhere to Quran and Sunnah, right? Secularism, on the other hand, right, is as an ideology, is the notion of separating church from state. Why did the Western, the philosophers of the Western world during the Renaissance, why were they concerned of separating church and state, right? Of course, we know about the transgressions of the church and the crime of the church and whatnot, but I think their vision was larger. And that is to limit the power of government, right? And to be more relevant to the average person. The state should not be someone who enforces morality or enforces religious law. It should be an entity that is concerned with their citizens, right? And the protection of their citizens and the welfare of their citizens, whatever that may be, right? And of course, this developed. Now, how separated is government from religious law and legislation? That is a good question, right? We're not going to be naive and say Republicans are not trying to apply Christianity, right, in their affairs. We're not going to say that. And we're not going to say Vice President Pence is not concerned with Christian law, right? But at the same time, there are these kind of boundaries that were drawn. How much authority does the church have, does the state have in dictating what is orthodox or not. Right? And this again goes back to what I've been talking about over the past several sessions. Right? When the scholars of Islam saw that the state or the government and the politicians are deviating in terms of the application of Islam, right? They are not as concerned, and they are willing to put aside our principles in order to execute some sort of political strategy, right? This created a lot of concern with the scholars. And Imam Shafi'i perhaps started the movement of separating the religious realm from the political realm, right? Where the state does not have authority in dictating law, because we as Muslims follow Islamic law. It is the scholars who say this is Islamic law and this is not Islamic law. So the idea, the concept of separating church and state is not something completely, I'm trying to be very, very precise in my words, it's not something completely against Islamic principles. Right. The state is obligated in applying Islam where Islam has spoken. Right? The state is not allowed to dismiss an Islamic ruling without evidence, right, or without justification for that. But at the same time, Muslims do not look to the state for our law. They look to the scholars for our law. Right? So you have something similar, right? You see some resonance here. And I wouldn't doubt that they're getting the idea from the Muslim world, but they took it to a different level, right? So that's one thing. The state should not be the one interfering in our religious lives, right? Nor should the state be the one who determines what is authentic, religiously speaking, and what is not authentic, right? It is not for the king of Jordan, for example, to say that this is Orthodox Islam and this is not Orthodox Islam. It's not for him to say that. It's not his specialty. It is the scholars who say that, right? Now, however, there are some concerns here. This model, there are some concerns here. And that goes back to the federal state, right? The idea that in a nation state, one law is, if the federal government passes a bill or passes a law, it is binding on all citizens regardless of their background or their religion. And sometimes this creates a little bit of tension, and it creates some strangles and some hurdles when it comes to pluralism and diversity. It really does. And again, these are massive topics that you can probably find PhD theses on talking about and major research. Now, in theory, and I'm taking this, I'm taking this from Dr. Sherman Jackson. I'm quoting. He has a beautiful article on. It's called "Secularism, Liberalism, Atheism, and the American Mosque, or Muslim American Mosque," something like that. And he talks about these, and I'm quoting him here in several of these slides. So he says, in theory, American secularism does not tell anyone what kind of religion he or she should have, or if he or she should have a religion at all. It merely seeks to regulate the impact of religion on collective life. But just as we saw in the case of liberalism, the uninterrupted transgenerational socialization of people into secular political outlooks, reflexes and modes of being will tend cumulatively to morph into a more secular outlook of life as a whole. American secularism clearly exercises influence far beyond the realm of the purely political sphere. Indeed, it promotes and sustains an overall secular mindset, right? Meaning, the government has built a state, and that state is built off laws. And these laws are promoted, right? They need to be adhered to. Now, laws aren't just something that direct our behavior. They also impact our mentality, our outlook on life. So, for example, the freedom of religion, freedom of speech, religion, and the press, right? This is the amendment of America. It is the principle of American lifestyle, right? So, growing up in America, honoring this Constitution, right, and pledging allegiance to the flag every day at school, you are accepting this notion of freedom of religion and press and speech, right? Not just in the way we behave with one another. When we deal with one another in that regard, I have to accept you even if I differ with you, right? This develops a certain mindset that is secular. Right? Are you following along so far? Because this is a little bit complex, right? Living in a secular state develops a secular outlook on life, right? So if you can imagine secularism is being, put on us. The government is sprinkling secularism on us. Behave this way, it is the law, right? Well, those sprinkles aren't just affecting the way we interact with each other, it's also affecting the way I observe the world as a whole. Does that make more sense? Is that clear? Right? It's affecting the way I view the world as a whole. And if I am now accustomed to accepting someone else, even if they believe in something else, it's no longer just, okay, I accept that you are like this way, right? I also have to modify my own principles that reject, for example, that reject the notion that there is a true theology beyond my own. Right? So in Islam, we believe in the deen عند الله Islam. Religion to Allah is Islam. Right? وَمَنْ يَبْتَغْ غَيْرَ الْإِسْلَامِ دِينًا فَلَنْ يُقْبَلَ مِنْهُ. Whoever seeks a religion other than Islam, it won't be accepted from them. Right? This is what the Quran preaches. Well, what secularism is telling us at the governmental level, you might disagree with so-and-so, but you have to accept them. And with time, that acceptance goes beyond just the way I interact with that person. It also starts modifying the way I understand this verse itself. Is that clear? Right. I need some more reaction. I don't know if should I continue or not.
It's okay.
Yeah.
It's good? Okay. So you see how that's working? So this is a major challenge of Muslims today, right? And we've all heard of those people, who say that, no, so long as you're a good Muslim or you're a good person, then that's what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants, right? We've all heard of this before, humanism and whatnot. Where is that coming from? No.
One question.
Sure.
The last ayah of Surah Al-Kafirun.
Right. Lakum dinukum waliya din.
So, how would you relate that to what
Right.
you just said? You see,
So-
that's the same idea, right?
Right. So at the governmental level, sure. Right? So as I mentioned before, we're not against all elements of secularism. Right? There are certain things that that perhaps someone can do research and find that the Western world, as they were developing the new world or modernity, right, they're taking it from Islam. They're importing it. And in fact, there are quotes of people saying, for example, Benjamin Franklin, I think it was Benjamin Franklin, word got to him that certain Americans killed a group of either slaves or Native Americans, right? And he said that if they were imprisoned in the Muslim world, they wouldn't have done this, right? And it said that Benjamin Franklin had a copy of the Quran, and it's in Congress, and whenever a Muslim enters Congress or one of these high political positions, they take oath on the Benjamin Franklin Quran, right? And Keith Ellis was the first one to do that, right? They were studying Islam and Islamic fiqh. And there is one theory that says that the French law is taken word from either the Maliki or the Hanafi fiqh. Right? Word for word. And that's why you find these similarities. It's not that Islam is against every notion that the secular world promotes. Right? It's that to what extent. Right? Does that make sense? So, lakum dinukum waliya din, yes, but at the same time, that is balanced with something else. Inna dina inda Allah Islam. Right? So the government is presenting, or the state, or society is presenting both, not just one. Right? The second thing that's introduced to the Muslim world as a result of colonialism is capitalism. Like capitalism, the system of economics. And if you were to look at a spectrum, right, here is socialism as a economic entity, and here is capitalism. Where does Islam fall? It probably falls somewhere here. Right? When communism, not socialism. When communism was being presented to the Muslim world during the 60s and 70s, during the time of Jamal Abdel Nasser, right? One scholar said that communism is the ideology of, excuse the word, of retarded people, right? Dhawil ahad. They realized that communism is trying to change something that is a basic of life. There are rich people and there are poor people. Right? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, Allahu yabsutu rizqa liman yasha wa yaqbid. Allah gives people and He withholds from people. That is part of natural life. So Muslims were very much against communism, and it did not gain much ground in the Muslim world. It was actually stopped very quickly over a decade or two by the scholars. But capitalism entered, right? Why? Because there are a lot of similarities. There are a lot of things that capitalism believes in and the Muslims accept. So, for example, the free market, the freedom to enter the market with a product you wish at any time, and to leave the market at any time. Right? The concept of supply and demand, these things, the Muslims were very much in acceptance, in accordance to that. There are some differences, though. And there's actually one more I should add. So the primary goal in a capitalistic economy is profit. Right? My goal is profit. Whereas in Islam, money is seen as a means to something else. And therefore, the primary goal is not profit. The primary goal is sustenance and to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. By sustaining ourselves, now we have a little bit of free time and some energy to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That is the idea. Right? So that is one major difference. Another major difference is interest. Capitalism is very much for interest. Islam, interest is forbidden. Right? And you can do simple research to see the harms of interest. Right? It's clear. It is the cancer of society. And as far as I am aware, every economic crash in America has been the result of some sort of interest-based transaction. Right? It is the cancer of the economy. Just like, an illness can be, cancer is the death of a human being. Right? So interest is forbidden in the Islamic economy. I put quotes by Islamic because there was never this thing called an Islamic economy. But it is a topic that is discussed, so I just put that there. Another difference, which I didn't put here, I'll add it inshallah, is that the concept of halal and haram. Right? There are things that are haram in Islam. It is haram to sell alcohol. It is haram to sell pork. Right? And we have to abide by that. Whereas in a capitalistic economy, it's a lot looser. Right? I'm sorry? They even promote it, right? So we have these moral restrictions that we need to adhere to. So morality does restrict, to an extent, our economy, right, based on what is haram. Another difference is a system of redistributing wealth. Islam has a very clear system of redistributing wealth through zakah, through the concept or the way spoils of war is redistributed, fate, the booty and whatnot, the idea of sadaqah, promoting sadaqah, charity, giving to the poor, etc. So Islam introduced a system of refreshing the economy so that the wealth does not become herded by the 1%. Right? The rich aren't getting richer all the time. Rather, there's this redistributing of wealth. In an Islamic contract, there must be a risk for loss. Right? Meaning a contract where there is no risk is an invalid contract. So an example is interest. Right? Interest is a guaranteed profit. There is no guarantee for loss. Or you know what, let me use a different example. Someone were to come and say, let us enter a partnership. Right? So I go to Muhammad and I say, Muhammad, let's start a business. Right? But under the condition that if we lose any money, I don't lose anything. Bonds is another example. Right? So bonds, you are investing your money and it's considered to be a loan and the person is gaining profit through interest. If the company or the company were to go bankrupt, the person does not lose a single penny. This type of contract is forbidden in Islam. Why? Because there is no risk factor. There needs to be a risk factor, even if it's very small. Right? We see, based on our studies, there's a 1% chance that we will lose. Right? That's fine, so long as there's the capacity for profit and for loss. It needs to be like that. Whereas in capitalism, if a person can be smart enough to make a contract where they are guaranteed and they cannot lose, then that is your cleverness. Gambling is forbidden in Islam, obviously, and gambling, by definition, there are many definitions in by the scholars. The scholars have many definitions for gambling, but perhaps the clearest one is that gambling is a contract where one person is guaranteed something, whereas the other person is not guaranteed it, right? Which is gambling, right? So, for example, when somebody buys a lottery ticket, the company that you're buying from, they are guaranteed that $10, whereas you are not guaranteed anything in return. That is gambling, right? So I go to Muhammad, I say, Muhammad, you have a book that I want to buy, can you sell it to me? He said, sure. I give him $10 and he says, okay, I might send it to you, I might not send it to you. You and your luck. This is what gambling is. Right? So in Islam, this is forbidden. And these two that I just mentioned, they're really defining or constricting our contracts, our trade contracts, to make sure that people aren't getting screwed over, as we say. And finally, in the individual versus society. In a capitalistic society or economy, the individual has precedence over society. Whereas in Islam, it tends to be society has a precedence over the individual, but not always. Right? So there are exceptions to that. So for example, selling alcohol. It can make someone a lot of money, right? But it harms greater society. Therefore, we're going to say it's not allowed. Now, next comes liberalism, the liberal versus liberalism. Again, secular versus secularism, liberal versus liberalism. These are two different things. So not every fiqh ruling is conservative based on our today's standards of morality, right? So if you look at today, you have the conservative right and the liberal left, and they have certain principles and whatnot. Islam isn't always on the right. Sometimes Islam is actually more liberal than the Western world itself, right? For example, the idea of polygamy. That's more liberal than than the Western world, right? So just to make sure that that's clear, we're not always on the right. In some issues, we are on the left. Now, so again, quoting Dr. Jackson, he says that there are three fundamental principles of liberalism. And again, think of this as how it affects the average Muslim's ability to engage Quran and Sunnah. The average Muslim's ability to understand Quran and Sunnah, the message of Quran and Sunnah. So the first principle is that the theoretical rejection of all sources of authority outside the individual or collective self as the basis of morality and or socio-political organization. Meaning what determines what's right and wrong is me. What determines what is moral, what is suitable for me, is me. Or some sort of self, some sort of human being. What this does is says the Quran is secondary. It is not the Quran that judges me, it is me who judges me. Right? Or some sort of organization that goes back to the individual that's judging me. Right? So you have a lot of strange behaviors that are going on. Now, aside from legal theories and whatnot, when you look at spirituality or morality and whatnot, right? So-and-so likes to do this. Well, we can't judge them, so long as they're not hurting anyone else, right? That is the extent of morality under a liberal paradigm. So long as you're not harming anyone else, you do whatever you want, right? Kill yourself, who cares, right? Who are we to judge you? So this is one of the fundamental principles of liberalism. Now, a Muslim who is trained in this regard, right? And now the Quran is saying, if you do this, you're going to hellfire. How can the Quran say that, right? And now we have to redefine what the Quran is saying in order to fit this fundamental principle. Number two, the commitment to individualism, self-fulfillment. It is about me, not about my family. It is about me, not about my responsibilities towards those I am responsible for. It is about me, not about my responsibilities towards society, right? And you as parents, you know the whole 9 yards, right? You know the whole 9 yards. Whereas Islam, it's not promoting this. Yes, you have rights, but other people have rights. And you have responsibilities towards fulfilling those rights. And look at marriage, for example. People get bored of marriage. My wife isn't taking care of me like she did a while ago, or my wife is this, or my husband is that, right? Or I feel this type of the middle age crisis and whatnot, right? Well, what about your responsibility to your family? What about your responsibility towards your kids? A woman can go to a one of these banks, right, and impregnate herself and have a child. What about that child's right to a father? What about that child's right to be born in a family that is stable? It's not considered. Why? Because, well, so long as you're not harming anyone else, it's your choice. Individualism. You are committed to yourself more so than you are to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. When in Islam, you are committed to Allah and held accountable by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And finally, number 3, Rawlsian public reason. So John Rawls has this notion of public reason, which I mentioned last week. And the idea of public reason is that when an entity presents a law, when the government presents a law, they need to consider 2 things, right? Number 1, they are presenting a law that is in the interest of all people, not just the self or a group of people, right? The second thing is that this law is presented to them in a reasonable fashion, meaning you are presenting the law to them in a way that is neutral and speaks to them as a human being, right? So I gave an example last week. I'll give it again. If someone were to ask me, is alcohol forbidden? I'm going to say yes. And if they ask me why is alcohol forbidden, I'm going to say because Allah made it forbidden, right? Now, to us Muslims, that is relevant. That is reasonable. Why? Because we believe in the Quran, and therefore the Quran is an authority to us. But if for example, an atheist young man were to come and say, what do you think of alcohol? And I say, we don't practice it, or we don't drink it, and he were to say why, I can't tell him that it's because Allah said so. Well, he doesn't believe in the existence of God for him to accept what I'm saying. Therefore, I need to present it in a way that is reasonable to him, or what we call today logical. Alcohol, we don't practice alcohol because it's harmful. It causes 100,000 deaths in America a year, right? It turns a person into a scoundrel, right? And the whole, how many problems come about because of alcohol: health issues, marital issues, issues with parents, issues with kids, all of it, right? This is what public reason is saying. Now, Dr. Jackson critiques public reason and says there's a problem here. And he says it falsely assumes that the prevailing cultural matrix will not constitute a plausibility structure that unfairly privileges some arguments, those of the rich, powerful, and majority, while penalizing others, those of the poor, minorities, and unpopular groups. Meaning, right, this idea of public reason assumes that we all have an equal voice, right? Whereas in reality, that's not the case. The richer, right, the more powerful, the majority has a stronger voice, and therefore what they say will become what's most relevant, despite it being irrelevant to other people, right? So this is a major flaw here, and it does not live up to what it's trying to do. In theory, it sounds good. In theory, it makes sense, but in application, it does not live up to what it's meant to do, right? And that's what Dr. Jackson is critiquing. And finally, this is the last slide. Yes. Finally, Enlightenment rationale. Now, I'm not an expert in this, but what this is the following. Rationalism is the epistemological view that regards reason as the chief source and test of knowledge. Meaning, the way we attain knowledge is through the mind. Anything beyond the mind is no longer a valid resource in coming to what we say is the truth. In other words, the Quran is not where we go to in order to understand the truth. Right? This is Enlightenment rationale, and this is now being presented. Right? Also, the criterion of the truth is not sensory, but intellectual and deductive. Meaning, it's not through our senses that we come to conclusions, rather it is through intellectual reasoning and deductivity. Right? Now, I'm not an expert in this, so I can't tell you what exactly this is, the extent of what this is trying to say. But one thing that I notice, right? When it comes to, for example, transgenders. Now, a male is defined as what? A female is defined as what? Right? We all know the definitions. Based on what? And based on these definitions, using our own sight, we can determine if someone is a male or female. Does that make sense? Right? Now, when someone who is now trying to promote transgenderism and gender fluidity, as they're calling it, right? They suspend one's senses, right? Your senses no longer have a say in determining if so-and-so is a male or female, right? This is very problematic. If subhanAllah, the Muslim philosophers are a lot smarter than modern day philosophers. Muslim philosophers say there are certain things that are realities, wajib, as they call it. That's the term they use. This is a wajib. This is a necessity. The sky is blue, right? So something like that, it's a necessity. Is that a piece of knowledge? It's not a piece of knowledge. Why? Because it's an obvious. This is not something you debate. You cannot debate whether the sky is blue or not. Why? Because our senses perceive it to be blue. You can debate why it's blue, right? But the fact that it's blue is factual. This is not something debatable, right? Now, with enlightenment rationale, it kind of ruptures this. And the question becomes as follows. Is a marker, let's not use this thing, this pointer right here. Is this pointer a pointer because of what it is, or because it was named a pointer? Meaning, what makes this a pointer? Is it because it functions in a way that is defined, or it's in a way that fits the definition of a marker or of a pointer? Or is this a pointer because I called it a pointer? All right? This is what enlightenment rationale is now trying to question. Okay, what's the point of this? The point of it is the following. If now you are able to question, if now you're able to pose these questions, you can now validly question that which was factual before. Right? Fornication is immoral. This was a fact. Throughout human history, not just Islamic history, human history. It is immoral. With enlightenment rationale, they pose this question and they start asking, well, is it really immoral? Or is it immoral because people said it was immoral? Right? Is it immoral because the act is an act of immorality? Or is it immoral because society said so? And this pretty much opens up the questioning of anything and everything. Right? That which your generation saw to be absolutely absurd. How can you even ask this question? Right? How can you even question how can you behave with your parents the way you do? This wasn't a question, right, in your generation. But my generation, I'm going to question my parents and I'm going to question my grandparents as well. Right? That's coming from enlightenment rationale. So that's a lot of information. But I hope this gives you a realization of what we are dealing with. And again, I said in the beginning, it's not that Muslims or Islam is incapable of dealing with this or no longer compatible with it. It's about changing the language to where it speaks to this, right? We need to understand what Muslims are dealing with and how it's developing them when they don't even know it's developing them. And who was it? I'm reading a book called about autonomy, right? A person's autonomy, meaning their self autonomy, self authority, right? They're the authority of the self. And the author says that he's kind of building a foundation on which he's going to talk about in the rest of the book. And he says, although some of these things are obvious and questionable, right? Although a lot of these things, these notions are questionable and easily rejectable, they are being taught to society in a phase when they don't even realize they're being taught it. Or they are incapable of even recognizing it or refuting it. Right? So when is all this being taught to society? It's being taught to the teenagers. And the teenagers do not have enough knowledge or experience to realize what's being said to them or to question what's even being said to them. All right? And this is how it grows. Right? So that concludes colonialism. We have one more unit left, and that is Islam in America, through which I'll very briefly go through how the earliest Muslims in America and what's going on today, um, the major Muslim groups, and maybe it's my own personal thoughts on what our vision needs to be, and some concluding comments, inshallah. So, does anyone have any questions?
Is there an agenda, you think, behind this enlightenment or affecting the teenagers?
Of course.
Changing?
Of course. I mean, you saw the video.
Yeah.
The video is very much fueled by socialism, right? And the guy from Shark Tanks, the Canadian, the billionaire, what's his name? O'Malley, I think, right? He was asked a question. I know these business people, although they have very little morality in terms of ethics, I should say, they have very little ethics, but they have a lot of insight. They've seen the world. And so he says that he was asked the question, why are people moving towards socialism? He said people aren't moving towards socialism, it's the young people who are moving towards socialism. But by the time they become adults and realize what the world is, they become conservative, right? So, there are certain ideals that seem nice, but realistically, they're not applicable, or they have major flaws, right? So yes, there is an agenda. No doubt there is an agenda. Disney has an agenda, right? And that is the liberalism. Liberalism, right? They want people to become more liberal. They don't like the idea of religion. Why? Because religion they see as constraining or fake or false, or they're just angry with God or something like that. It could be that. And there are, just like Fox News has a conservative agenda, right? Just like, certain political figures have certain agendas. Everyone has an agenda, right? Islam has an agenda, right? But what's Islam's agenda? To call people to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right?
So how you see, as you mentioned, that all these things are the philosophies which were implemented and Islamic philosophies were there. Do you see some effort going on right now in an organized way from Islamic point of view to look into it, either debate it or redefine it? Is there any activity going on?
So, 99.9% of Americans don't know anything about this. So it's hard to have a conversation or a movement within greater American society that directly addresses this, right? Where the conversations are going on aren't at the masjid level, they're at the university level. So I quoted Dr. Sherman Jackson, and he's someone who very much talks about this. Talal Asad, who I mentioned the very first lecture, right? He very much talks about this, right? And it might seem like their efforts are insignificant, but it's not. It's not insignificant because in the end, universities here in America are the driving ideological forces. They are, right? This is where, from here starts these new ideologies that then reach the political level and then is spread to the elite level, I should say, not the political, the elite level, right? And then it's spread to greater society. So, although that someone like Dr. Sherman Jackson isn't as popular as someone like Omar Sulaiman, right? But Dr. Jackson is teaching 300 students a semester about Islam at USC. And a lot of these students end up going to Harvard Law School, right? Or, these elite Ivy schools, and they become lawyers, judges, politicians, doctors, business people, right? It does have an effect, but that's where it's happening. So any addressing of these issues needs to be indirect, or else it just goes over people's heads.
I think his point is, let's see, there is an agenda, just like you said.
Mm-hmm.
I think there is an agenda. And I'm going to give you a quotation from Henry Kissinger.
Okay.
30 years ago. It is a great tragedy that the oil resources of the world are in Muslim countries. His exact quote.
Mm-hmm.
So you can see the mind of the man, and he's in a very powerful position. And this is just one man voicing their opinion, but this is a collective idea. So I think the question the brother had is, we have to understand the thinking of these powers, the world powers, the global powers, whoever they are. And we have to be able to counter it. We can't just say, oh, well,
I agree.
It's too bad, well, what are we going to do,
I 100% agree.
So to counter it, you have to have somebody who has the same intellectual capacity. It's like a chess game.
Right.
They're making their moves, but we're just watching.
Right.
Instead of watching, we have to participate in this game.
Right, I agree. And in order for that to happen, for Muslim Americans, these intellectuals need to be invited to these major conventions. But they're not.
Yeah.
They're not, because they're following the culture, right? And I hope to write a small article kind of hoping someone will listen, and quoting the verse, فَخَلَفَ مِن بَعْدِهِمْ خَلْفٌ أَضَاعُوا الصَّلَاةَ وَاتَّبَعُوا الشَّهَوَاتِ. Right? After the prophets came a generation that left prayer and followed their desires. Now all these conventions are about getting the most popular people, right, who are cool and hip, and you have the comedian who comes, and you have the band or the concert that comes, right, and they're trying to create a culture, and it's all fun and games and it's entertainment, right? Dawah is becoming more of entertainment than it is education, right? Now I'm not calling these conventions or these people as being immoral or insincere, but this is a problem. I mean, are we trying to develop a generation that only practices Islam and only cares about Islam when they're entertained? That's very problematic. Very problematic.
No,
right?
I completely, I agree with you.
So this is where it needs to start.
But it would, I don't think it will happen at that level. That it's for some, at some stage that's fine. I mean, at the level that you're talking about, like these conventions, MSA or ISNA or whoever. It's good. The gathering is good. The socialization and the sort of community awareness of because the truth of the matter is, the Muslims themselves don't know what Islam is.
Right.
They don't.
I agree.
So this is a way of maybe educating them.
I definitely agree.
Right? Along with that, you need people like yourself, or if there are other people who understand the deeper significance of what is going on globally, that we have to have a think tank. I mean, the Muslims should have a RAND corporation somewhere. I don't know where it's going to be, whether it's in Kazakhstan or Istanbul or Timbuktu, whatever spot you want to put it. But they have to have a RAND corporation that can understand what is going on and make global decisions.
You have organizations starting like that. So you have the ISPU, I don't know what the acronym stands for, but it really does a lot of studies on the Muslim statistics about Muslims, right, in America and North America or the West or whatever it is, and they're presenting information. You have Yaqeen Institute that's presenting more academic type articles and research. You're starting, but the concern is, and I'm not accusing anyone, the concern is that a lot of times they have a certain paradigm which they are trying to promote, right? So you'll find some of these organizations are very much pro-activism. And again, don't start connecting dots. That's not what I'm trying to do. But it's just a concern. And this is human nature, right? So it's not an issue of people being insincere or immoral or unethical. It's just human nature. But there is a way of addressing that, and I'll get to that in a second. There's a certain paradigm that there's a certain ideology they are trying to present, right? That's just reality. For example, you can't, Al Jazeera is a very prominent news channel, media outlet, right? But it's very much influenced by Muslim Brotherhood ideology, okay? Fine. If someone were to present an article that criticizes Muslim Brotherhood, would they ever publish it? Right? So this is kind of a concern. That's number one. Number two is this is my personal opinion, and I hope I'm wrong, I think that Muslims don't even understand the vision of the Quran.
Yeah, so that's the root problem. That right there, that is the root problem.
And I'm not talking about the average Muslim, I'm talking about even the imams.
Yeah, absolutely.
They don't understand what is the point of the Quran, where's the Quran taking the individual. Right.
I just very brief. I think what we see here are the professional societies. That is where I see that all the the elite and everybody is there, but the main presentations and discussions are basically on those. The professors are there, you are making presentation. So that is the forum actually where when it will start, that will create, it's a very selected, only very selected people go there who have a professional interest there. It's not just a get together.
Right.
So I think at some point these societies, and that's what actually happened for science. If you see, in Europe, Society of this, European Society of England, the Royal Society of this. So I think that will be the forum where it will be very much a group of people who are in Islamic specialty. I don't know whether some activity on that level is going on.
You can check on YouTube. I mean, Dr. Jackson has a lot of talks. Dr. Muhammad Fadil is another very interesting intellectual. But he's very much pro-Rawlsian thought, but he's still very intelligent. I had the privilege of taking a class with him. He's tough. I tried debating him, but mashallah, he's tough. You have for example, Dr. Uwaymir Anjum, who most of these sessions, I've been taking his slides. I mean, he allowed me to use his slides. Jazakallah khair. He's another intelligent individual who can address these issues. You do have a lot. They're just not the popular ones. They have some popularity, right? It's not like they're unknown, but it's not like they are the one with 1 million followers. It just tells you what Muslims want, right? And that's more entertainment than education. No.
I think this is a good attempt. It is putting everything, I didn't follow all these things, but these are the attempts to understand.
Right.
Before doing anything, you have to understand, you have to realize.
Right. Inshallah, maybe this is the start of a lot more. Yeah. Yes.
I have a question
Sure.
on secularism. Like for an average Muslim who's trying to practice Islam as best as he can, living in a secular country, what should he do when it comes to a conflict between a secular option and a religious option? Like for instance, Islamic housing versus regular mortgage and purchasing a house. Like should he use his best judgment or approach Islamic organization based in a secular country, in your opinion?
So you first have the fiqh element of that. What is halal and what is haram, right? So if you have a halal option and a haram option, well, that's obvious. Right? But if you have two halal options, one is a Muslim organization and the other is a non-Muslim organization, which one do you choose? You could choose whichever you want. Now, if you want to support the Muslim organization, great. May Allah reward you for that. That's part of ta'awun al-birri wa taqwa, helping each other on birr and taqwa, on piety and God consciousness, right? But it wouldn't be unethical for you to choose another option if you feel like it's more in benefit to you, right? Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Any other questions?
It's related to the secularism my friend asked. Is how secular should be like a society to be an ideal religious society?
I mean, it's hard to say that. It's hard to come up with an ideal society.
Like let's say Turkey, so kind of.
But I mean, you can't. So Turkey has its own realities. Turkey is trying to recover from. The Ataturk government, right? So they're dealing with a certain reality, and that's why it's hard to say that there's an ideal Muslim state, or that there's an ideal way of doing things. There's 1,001 things to consider, right? And there's 1,001 hurdles that need to be hopped over, and 1,001 enemies who are trying to take you down. That's just the reality. Knowledge always helps to make things clear, right? And fiqh is rich enough to give you the options, to let you know what is acceptable and versus what is something that's completely unacceptable, right? And there's a lot of flexibility for a righteous leader to deal with, to work with, right? So again, I guess Turkey is an example of how capable Islam is, even against the odds. Erdogan's dealing with an ultra-secular state, right? And it's just absolutely phenomenal how he's able to win the hearts of Muslims and seculars alike, right? That's saying something. So, I don't know how I can answer that question, to be honest.
So it goes more towards a social type of society, or I know mostly what you said about the capitalism, Islam is more rejecting more ideas of capitalism. So is it like a more
So
socialist?
Islam's tension with some elements of capitalism is not at the social level, it's at the contract level, the fiqh level, right? Yes, capitalism does develop a certain mindset, right? I'm not going to deny that. But I think it would be, what's the word I'm looking for? It would be naive to say that Islam is always for society or always for the individual. You have here and here, right? So it's not black and white. There's a lot of gray. It's a very deep question that I don't think can be answered in 2 minutes or 3 minutes. No. وإياكم. صلى الله على نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. Thank you for your patience.